Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Peter and Daniel for arranging this and the staff of LOPC for putting this all together. I'm looking forward to talking to you about my project and a little bit about my personal story as well. This is a book that just came out in late spring, in May. When I started the project about 10 years ago, I was confused about my subject. That's part of why I was interested in spending time with it. I confused charisma with charm. I thought that I would be researching and writing about a lot of really charming people with very high emotional intelligence, really good at working a room. I also associated charisma with great public speaking. Now, charm and inspiring oratory did show up in my research, but more in the breach than in the broad pattern of things. I realized that whatever charisma is, it is not charm. And a key giveaway is its deeply polarizing effect on people. Charismatic leaders have a lot of people who adore them and a lot of people who loathe them, and not very many at all who are just lukewarm. So today my plan is to tell you about a new way of thinking about charisma that has helped me pull together some patterns across American history and in our own time, and how that intersects with my own change of mind in recent years about the gospel. So let me give you the definition of charisma that I finally settled on. Charisma is a relationship between a leader and followers based on telling a story. A charismatic leader invites followers into a compelling narrative that does a better job of making sense of their lives than whatever story they were using before. But if you are outside of that story, if you don't have a role in it, it is totally baffling. And a clue to how baffling it can be is the fact that even totally secular people often resort to quasi-magical, religious hypnotism metaphors. They use words like mesmerize. They talk about a leader magnetizing an audience, converting followers to a cause. And I think this is because charisma is a concept that we punt to when we can't identify totally rational, straightforward, material explanations for the relationship between a leader and followers. There is something else going on, and we sense it. We sense it's important, but we don't quite understand it. This is exactly why the German sociologist Max Weber borrowed the term charisma from Scripture, from the world of biblical studies and church history, a little bit more than 100 years ago. He's really the one who deserves credit for coining the term as we use it commonly in everyday speech, at least outside of the church today, to describe a kind of authority that is distinct from the authority that comes with tradition or a position in an institution or having a big military. A power that seems to reside in the leader as a person. The word charisma comes originally from the ancient Greek, charis, meaning divine anointing, chosenness by the gods, a chosenness that brings with it special power that might redound to good or evil. In the New Testament, St. Paul makes this charisma, which means, broadly speaking, grace, spiritual gifts from God. Weber took the New Testament idea and he reframed it in a way that would be more useful, more approachable for his secular colleagues in the new social science disciplines. But to me, the phenomenon that Weber and the secular observers who have come after him have tried to name is really not all that far from the supernatural thing that Paul was talking about in the New Testament. In both the religious and the secular sense, charisma centers on the human desire to touch otherworldly power, to seek a place in a big, transcendent narrative that lends meaning to our lives, that gives us a sense of control over chaos. And whether you find a charismatic leader compelling or revolting depends on whether he or she is offering you an attractive part in the story they're telling. Now, I want to add a caveat here. When I call a leader's message a story, I am not saying that it's necessarily fiction. I think we tend to equate storytelling with making stuff up, and that's a mistake. Humans are storytelling, story-seeking creatures. This is just how we organize information about the world. The difference between a charismatic leader who is an agent of moral progress and one who is not, it has everything to do with whether the story the person offers is grounded in reality. And certainly, some leaders are fabulists who draw back the veil on a pseudo-reality. But charisma in itself is morally neutral. I think this way of approaching charismatic leadership as transcendent storytelling might help with a problem that scholars and journalists who study religion have been dealing with for a few decades now. For a long time, those of us who work in this field have relied on the benchmarks associated with traditional religious institutions to track what's happening to the religious impulse. So we pay a lot of attention to church attendance and membership numbers, statements coming from leaders of big religious institutions, this kind of thing. Those tools don't serve us very well anymore. Every year seems to bring a new study that shows the rising number of people who say they have no religious affiliation whatsoever, right? The so-called nuns. The figure is now about 28%, although it seems to have plateaued. It may actually be declining, especially among younger people in the West, and this is something maybe we can talk about later if you're interested. I'm particularly interested in the people who call themselves spiritual but not religious, right? This is often an option on these polls. I think that's a clue to something interesting, and about half of the people who have no religious affiliation are in that category. I think it's a mistake to assume that just because the religious impulse is not landing as predictably as it once did in the traditional places, that means it's vanishing. The question, then, is where should we look? And I think one place that it's interesting to look is in the relationship between certain leaders and followers. My book starts in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, and it covers about 4 centuries of history. Today, I thought I would focus on the later part of the book that's more immediately connected to our current moment. I want to tell you a bit about the kind of charismatic appeal that seems to have particular power now, especially in this country. And then I will say a little bit about what it's like to be minding your own business as an agnostic historian, working in your neat and tidy closed universe, and then to get rudely interrupted by the possibility that the religion you have spent your entire career studying may actually be true. So I need to warm up a little bit before I get to the personal stuff. Let me start with this basic question of authority, trust, how Americans develop a narrative of what's going on in the world, because that's the broad context that any leader who's coming with a new story to tell has to work in. It has become a cliche to point out that Americans have a low level of trust in institutions. But the polls are really striking. 1958 was the first year when the National Election Study asked Americans, do you trust the federal government to do the right thing all or most of the time? In 1958, 75% said yes. Now, that number has generally sloped down ever since. It's today at an average of 22%, with Republicans a little bit lower, Democrats a little bit higher. But the federal government is not the only, the only institution that has come in for this, right? Last year, according to Gallup, 32% of Americans said they had either a great deal or a lot of trust in churches and organized religion. Now that's compared to about 60% a generation ago, so another really big drop. Trust in higher education, Congress, mainstream media, even the military has all dropped. Now, why is this important for the story of charisma? Because these numbers tell us about one category of leader that definitely lacks charisma right now, and that's experts. Institutions tend to be full of experts, right? They're staffed by experts. They're in the business of training experts. They are premised on the idea that you need a certain kind of experience and certification from other people in the field to deserve the faith of the public. That whole idea is falling apart. I want to suggest that the era immediately preceding our own, so roughly 1945 to the early 1970s, set us up for this in some special ways. That was the era when respect for professional expertise, the charisma of experts, the power of the story that experts told about the world, you could say, when that reached a peak and then fell apart. That in our own time, we have seen the rise of a different type of charismatic leader, a type I call the guru. Now, what's a guru? A guru tells you to put your trust in him or her as an individual. They might connect themselves to an institution or a tradition, but they position themselves as the best interpreters. Second, a guru presents a totalizing worldview. So if you accept the assumptions that he or she presents, then you have answers for every big question about right and wrong and the ultimate goals of life without having to think much about it. Third, that worldview is based on an alternate picture of reality, a new set of facts that are at odds with what outsiders see. And last, gurus tend to operate adjacent to electoral politics rather than right in it, although sometimes they do make the leap. Now, before I say more about the guru, I want to talk about the age of the expert. The 50s and 60s were the heyday of cultural authority for secular scientific expertise in North America. So think of higher education booming after World War II, lots of federal investment in research. Later, the technocrats working for John F. Kennedy on economic policy, on the Vietnam War, pitching the new frontier to Americans. A story that essentially said, invest in expert-led innovation, expert-designed foreign policy, and America will spread democracy and high standards of living and get us to the moon. I'll add that the 50s and the 60s were the last time when you could say that traditional religious institutions and religious experts were in charge as well. What I mean is that this was the last era when liberal Protestant mainline churches were thriving, at least by the numbers. Those denominations peaked essentially in their numbers in 1965 and have been going down ever since then. So just for example, the Presbyterian Church in the USA had about 4.25 million members in 1965, and today has about 1 million members. And keep in mind that the US population has grown by about 75% in that time. So that's a steep drop. And that's typical of what the churches we'd call kind of the mainline denominations. Another trend I want to flag in the post-war era is the beginning of the charismatic renewal movement, which was an explosion of Holy Spirit charisma, like the original New Testament kind, in churches that had never known this power before, at least not in this miraculous sensory way, speaking in tongues, people with their hands in the air getting slain in the Spirit. These revivals spread around the world. You could argue that it's still going on in many ways. And in some respects, charismatic renewal did breathe a new vitality into some churches, especially established churches, Episcopalians in the Los Angeles area. The Catholic Church, once the Vatican got over its initial nervousness about these revivals, really embraced charismatic renewal worldwide. But at the same time, I think you could argue that charismatic renewal chipped away at traditional Christian institutions, which is something revivals usually do, and emboldened over the long term independent megachurch pastors, religious entrepreneurs, maybe we could say, rather than older groups and denominations. You also probably associate the 50s and the 60s with the rise of the counterculture, which certainly was a movement driven by skepticism of institutions. My point is that by the 60s, we have a complicated picture. Experts and the the people who have benefited from sort of the established nodes of authority in higher education, the establishment church leaders seemed pretty comfortable in their cultural authority, but there are signs that this is starting to erode. So let me give you a snapshot from the end of this period. And this was a moment in my research when I really saw the advantage of putting the narrative of mainstream political history alongside the history of strange supernatural stuff that historians normally keep kind of cordoned off. So let's zoom in on one place in time. 1970. Southern California, specifically UCLA. Picture Angela Davis striding across campus. She's 26. She's a proud member of the Communist Party. She's just coming off a stint in Germany where she was doing graduate work in Marxist philosophy. And she's come back to the States to get involved with the Black Panthers. UCLA has hired her to teach a few classes while she's finishing up her dissertation. She likes to teach in a miniskirt. Her natural hairstyle frames her face in a perfect sphere, and she packs in the students. They love her. She dismisses class at the end of lecture. They won't leave. They come down, hang around the podium, working up the nerve to ask a question. Protesters hang around too. If we were there, we would see gaggles of middle-aged Czech refugees, members of the local chapter of Young Americans for Freedom. Ronald Reagan is governor of California at this time, right? So he's on the UC Board of Regents ex officio, and they are trying to get Davis fired, or at least deny students credit for her classes. There are death threats. She has to get a bodyguard. Now, what is the story she's telling? Well, from one angle, it's the Marxist arc of history, the coming class war. But Davis is also pitching legions of students on a story about institutions and how they have failed in everything from Vietnam to civil rights. She has burrowed, as many of them have, into the heart of the ivory tower as a PhD student, and she is using academia's own platforms to declare the whole system illegitimate. Now, just a short walk away from the UCLA classrooms where Davis was teaching, you'd find a very different scene in an old frat house. The frat boys are gone. It's been taken over by a group called the Jesus Christ Light and Power Company, which is a Christian commune run by a former Campus Crusade worker, a guy named Hal Lindsey. When reporters find him, he's usually in a tank top, jeans, leather boots. He's talking to college kids in his Texas drawl about the rapture and the Antichrist. It's 1970, so he has just published his famous best-selling book, The Late Great Planet Earth, all about the coming apocalypse. This frat house was an outpost of the Jesus People movement, a mix of disillusioned hippies and middle-class kids fleeing their parents' churches. So It's a movement that grew out of established institutions, but it loathes those institutions. Here's Lindsay talking to a reporter. He says, "These kids hate impersonalness, bigness, irrelevance, materialism. And I've just given you a description of the average institutional church." Now, I'm not saying that the New Left student activists and the kids listening to Hal Lindsey were part of one unified movement, but I am saying that the Jesus people seeking the Holy Spirit and the charismatic relationship that Angela Davis had with her followers are on a continuum. They are related responses to the same cultural situation. They reflect a shared sense of being fed up with the cosmos, a hunger for a new eschatology, a promise of how all this injustice is going to end. There's a way in which it's these young people, shaped by working inside institutions but feeling betrayed by them, who help tear down the authority of universities, the authority of the mainline churches. And so it makes sense that the 60s and the 70s were also an age of new religious movements, ranging from the infamous and scary ones like Jim Jones' People's Temple to cases that were sometimes benign, sometimes abusive, like the evangelical charismatic Children of Love, Scientology. We also have in this time a profusion of religious communities coming from East and South Asia that could sometimes turn authoritarian, but really appealed to Americans who were looking to break away from traditional spiritual authorities. So I'm thinking of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and transcendental meditation, or the Guru Maharaji, who was just 13 years old when he came to the US in 1971 and started inspiring disaffected student radicals to move into ashrams. These movements varied tremendously in theology and practice, but they all orbited around a guru, a charismatic leader who could look at you and make you feel seen, make you feel that all your problems that you thought you were carrying alone are now acknowledged as real and serious, and they're not random. They are part of a bigger narrative that you will be able to see too if you only come along and see how the world really works. The 60s and the 70s are also the age of the rise of humanist psychology. When we have psychologists like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers hanging out at Esalen, writing books that say, essentially, the key to happiness is this thing that Maslow calls self-actualization, right? Cultivating the authentic inner you, no matter what institutions or traditions say. Humanist psychology promises that you can be your own Messiah. You can be the agent of your own salvation. And the most successful gurus play on this. They say, follow me on this path to your authentic self. By the time we are in the 1970s, the decline of mainline church membership and attendance is undeniable. And scholars zoom out, and they often call the big picture here secularization. We normally understand that term as a comment very specific to organized religion. But to me, the main meaning of secularization is eroding trust in institutions in general. And a corollary of that is eroding trust in experts. That's the big story, of which the membership numbers of the PCUSA are one small piece. The rise of charismatic cult leaders and gurus independent of any institution, even if they were themselves deeply religious people, this was a key aspect of secularization. By the time we get to the 1980s, the guru is not just a leadership model that you see on the margins. This model of authority takes off. It takes off in the self-help industry, in the business world, in leadership studies programs at business schools. where the trendy message is that your boss should be your coach, should come alongside you and help you become your most authentic self. Maybe an icon of this period generally is that mix of self-help and televangelism that we see in Oprah Winfrey, who was just coming to national prominence at this point. Her show becomes nationally syndicated in 1986. And I'd argue you also see hints of it in a brash New York businessman who went on Oprah's show a couple of times and speculated about running for president, Donald Trump. Two things make charismatic leaders more compelling, maybe more dangerous in our current era. First, in the past, institutions and traditions were stronger, and I think they provided a counterweight. They provided an alternative context and source of identity in which, or against which, people could evaluate a new story that they were hearing from a leader. Second, the cultural authority of organized religion has been on retreat for at least 2 generations. This has fed both a crisis of meaning and a tendency to transfer religious impulses to politics. It's also fed a crisis of confidence, I think, among lay people and leaders who have stuck with the traditional churches. And when you are insecure about your status in the culture, you are maybe particularly vulnerable to a leader who shows up promising you political power. The history of charismatic leaders in this country and their influence now only becomes legible, I think, if we are willing to ask theological questions. What is the transcendent narrative that this leader is offering? How has he turned the feeling of tribe into the feeling of being part of a pure, holy remnant? I'll add that we are seeing right now Pentecostal and Holy Spirit-oriented Catholic and Anglican churches growing in really unexpected ways among young people across the West, not just in the US. There's really interesting numbers on this coming out of the UK, France, Finland, other places. What if we consider that secular and religious people may not actually be so different, and that the contact with supernatural power that these converts are seeking has at least a family resemblance to the promise of transcendence that you find in some varieties of politics on both the left and the right? If the religious impulse is not landing in church, it will land somewhere else. I'll add that I've seen humans as fundamentally religious creatures for my whole career as a historian and a journalist. This is not just a view that I came to after I became a Christian. I don't think you need to be a Christian or even a theist to see our species this way. Plenty of atheists in the world of evolutionary psychology will say that humans have evolved into religious beings because of the survival goods that come with some religious practices and values. They encourage us to behave for the good of the tribe, even when no human authority is watching, this kind of thing. I have never been an atheist. Until about 3 years ago, if you had asked me to explain my worldview, I would have described myself as an agnostic pragmatist in the style of the philosopher William James. James's whole idea was that truth is out there, but it's an asymptote that we can never reach. We can get closer, but we can never reach. So we should be constantly willing to test out new ideas, to see which ideas work best to describe our world. And when new evidence comes our way, we have to be willing to revise our working hypothesis of the universe, if necessary. I grew up totally secular, but from college onward, I was interested in religion. I was envious of people who seemed to have answers to all the big questions. So I became a professional student of Christianity as a way of sidling up alongside the thing I wanted, and which I couldn't connect with in any way except this path I knew, reading a lot of books, footnotes, academic inquiry. In more recent years, as a journalist, I often found myself using theological language when I wrote about politics. I would look at, out of whack priorities on both the left and the right, and I would instinctively see them as idolatry. And I believed in original sin for as long as I can remember. Now, I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, but I don't think I was that unusual as a secular person who still relied on Christian concepts to explain the world, and who had this lurking feeling that it was not a great thing that religious institutions were dying out or having a hard time. So I had drafted about 2/3 of this book that I've been telling you about when I got interrupted. What happened, briefly, was this. In the spring of 2022, I was writing a magazine article about a Southern Baptist megachurch in North Carolina near where I live. And the pastor there evangelized me. Now, I'll point out at the outset, I had never been evangelized before. And this is interesting because I had spent a lot of time talking with all sorts of American Christians, especially evangelicals, for over the course of about 2 decades. I think it's a testament to how taboo evangelism has become in our culture. It's like the ultimate offense in our "you have your truth, I have mine." It's the ultimate offense to suggest to someone that they might have the wrong view of the universe. The pastor of this church, whose name is J.D. Greer, understood that I'm a historian, and he approached me in that way. He was pretty good at anticipating how a historian is likely to think about evidence and truth. And he helped me see something obvious, but I guess every conversion is a story of epiphanies of the obvious. As an agnostic, I had always been paralyzed by all the crazy stuff that comes along with Christianity, right? Because it's not just Jesus, it's all these miracles recounted in the Bible. The idea of hell, the end times. It's a lot to process. And so much of it seems, like the claims of other world religions, basically unverifiable. Like, where do you even start? JD helped me see that yes, all those topics are important, but Christianity stands or falls on one thing, and it's a claim that Christians make about something that either did or did not happen in history. I mean, this is Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, right? If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. He's very clear. It all hinges on the resurrection, not as a metaphor, but as an event in history. To my shame, even though I am a historian of Christianity, it's what I do for a living, I had not seriously investigated the literature on the historical evidence for and against the resurrection. I just had no idea how vast and how interesting it was. So I started reading a pile of books, spending weekends on academic journal databases, reading articles about biblical criticism by skeptics, by believing scholars, diving into giant doorstoppers by people like the theologian N.T. Wright, Richard Bauckham. They were both really important for me. Also reading books by my atheist colleague, Bart Ehrman, other skeptical scholars, really trying to get a sense of the whole terrain of these debates. I was also reading a lot of cosmology, too, because remember, at this point, I was not even a theist. So I had to kind of work on a parallel track, right? Because you can't really get to the resurrection unless you have some ability to believe in an intelligent, divine creator. I was praying a lot. To my shock and slight embarrassment, I was continuing to go to this megachurch on Sundays. And I was reading the Gospels again and finding that they were hitting me in a new way. Not in a mystical way, although I was starting to see Jesus for the first time. But what I really mean is that they were hitting me as compelling primary sources, as historical documents that, when you're just investigating them, they do not need the special pleading of divine inspiration to convey a credible picture of some bizarre events. I became persuaded by the scholarship that argues that these accounts are not some confused product of a community game of telephone or an accretion of myths over a long period of time, but are documents written by authors fairly close to the events they describe, who were scrambling to get down notes on strange stuff that they saw or heard about and did not totally understand. Now, I was hyper aware that this whole process was very nerdy and cerebral. It didn't seem like one could just read enough footnotes and then become a Christian. I mean, I wanted nothing more than like a lightning bolt born again experience. I prayed for that a lot. I did not get it. But in retrospect, I do see that God had led me to a place where I could approach all this new information with a much more open mind than I'd had before. I told you that in my research for my book, I realized that what all charismatic leaders offer is a compelling story. And I was at the point where the story that I had told myself about my life and my work and the world was not working for me anymore. Looking back on my academic career, I see that when I became a professor, for me, it was almost the secular equivalent of joining a religious order. This fraternal band of colleagues devoted to this higher, holy good, the project of advancing knowledge. And it always bothered me, it still does, that we don't wear our academic gowns very often. I love the medieval monastic aspect of it. But recently I had started to question this whole story. I was bothered by problems I saw in trying to come up with a philosophical basis for universal moral claims without God. And over the past decade or so, I had become disturbed by the increasing politicization and intellectual narrowing in secular higher ed, and how both professors and students were afraid to question what was happening. I was seeing a kind of illiberalism that is at odds with the Enlightenment project that I thought I had signed onto. I was treating the university as my church. That's what I see now, and it was never meant to play that role. I think this sense of dislocation set me up to question my own assumptions in a new way. As I was reading these books on the resurrection, I realized that I had never been quite as open to the claims of Christianity as I had thought. Even though I always thought of myself as an agnostic, not an atheist, I thought I am open to the claims of all these interesting groups I'm studying. The truth is that I did have a very strong anti-supernaturalist bias. I moved through the world as if it is a closed universe. Even though I could not prove this, even though lots of humans have experiences to the contrary. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I was not entitled to this assumption. It was an assumption. It was an act of faith. It was not something that I could just hold on to without questioning it. So as I was coming to these reluctant conclusions, I had to constantly take notes. Now, I am not a journaler, but I found that if I did not write all this down and force myself to reread my own notes a lot, I would just slide back into familiar epistemological grooves. Oh yeah, N.T. Wright makes a really interesting argument here, but come on. I'm not the kind of person who believes those sorts of things. That's not a rational objection. That's a mental habit. I see now that these past few years, I've been writing a book that is about spiritual hunger and what people do with that hunger, how they satisfy it, how leaders use it and sometimes manipulate it. That is the core of charisma. But as I was writing this, I was myself suffering from pretty acute spiritual hunger. And I was struggling with this in our secular age when institutions are weak, when the mainstream culture feeds us the message that the key to a good life is to just live your own truth. Recently, I heard a progressive atheist philosopher say that America's main social goal should be maximal self-expression for all individuals. I thought that was really interesting. It was a great way of putting the mainstream view. But that goal is itself a product of a specific time in Western culture. And part of what I have tried to chronicle in Spellbound is the rise of this gospel of self-invention, self-salvation in the 1960s, the stew of humanist psychology and positive thinking that I think set people up to fall for gurus. Because when the culture tells us that we can save ourselves and then we can't, we end up anxious and broken, and we want someone with answers. I'm grateful that the person who evangelized me is not a guru. A guru presents himself as the final authority and has the tendency to shut down certain questions. A good evangelist comes alongside you and says, I'm confident in what I believe, but the universe is a strange place, and our God is a mysterious God, and I am still learning. I am learning right along beside you. A good evangelist is constantly connecting you with the huge range of resources in the Christian tradition and with other Christian friends and pastors. And this is crucial, senses when and how to back away and let you make your own decisions. Finally, after an exhausting summer of this research and praying and Bible reading and megachurch going, I thought, well, okay, I'm not 99% convinced that the resurrection happened, but I am well north of 51%. Also, maybe what all of these Christians I keep asking for help, maybe what they say is true, that if I claim I want the experiential part of faith, then I have to take the risk. If faith is a relationship, I have to enter the relationship. So that's how I got to the point of moving from the prayer, God, if you exist, please show yourself to me, to the prayer, God, I would still really like for you to show yourself, but okay, I submit, Jesus, you are Lord and Savior. And then 6 days later, this former pagan, who was always a giant high church smells and bells snob, found herself in the jacuzzi tank on stage at this megachurch with a black Jesus in my place t-shirt, getting baptized by the former president of the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, all this was a little bit surprising to a lot of my secular friends and family. One thing they said is, Molly, you're a historian of religion. Not only that, you are a historian of American evangelicalism. You have spent your career studying the good and the bad and the ugly of church history, and you're writing a book about charismatic leaders and new religious movements and people falling for tall tales. So how could you be falling for one yourself? It's It's not an unreasonable question, but I think it gets the whole issue backward. If my book is about anything, it's about the fact that there is not that much space between the human hunger for the Holy Spirit, New Testament charisma, and our attraction to charismatic leaders. There's one deeper impulse beneath both. It's not an accident that Max Weber came up with his definition of charisma at the very same time that the Pentecostal Azusa Street revival was exploding in Los Angeles. If I'm arguing that this is what humans are like, that this is what we want, then why would I think that I am any different? Being a good historian requires realizing that I never come to the end of my own provincialism, and that I am never totally outside the stories I'm trying to tell. Thank you.
It's sort of a basic question, going back 2,000 years. So Christ, when he spoke, people listened. Is this kind of a positive, charismatic ability on his part? No matter, is it the way he spoke or what he said or just what? What would you say?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think going on the biblical accounts that we have, we know that some people listened, but a lot of people didn't listen to him. A lot of people who saw, him do miracles didn't believe, or they listened and they fit him into their own framework, right? The Herodians and the Pharisees certainly listened to him, but they don't actually hear him. So is he? You're asking? Is there something? Well, I suppose from the kind of sociological perspective, how do we understand Jesus in the kind of schema that I'm suggesting of charismatic leadership? I think that's one approach that's interesting, and it's adjacent to, but maybe separate from, the approach that a Christian would take. When I think about my typology, I mean, I certainly do think it's fair to say that Jesus was a guru. He absolutely, I mean, he's pretty clear, right? In John 14, he says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So absolutely, he's making a pretty monopolistic claim on truth. And it should have, and still does, set people's alarm bells ringing, right? To say, okay, this is a wild claim that I need to interrogate. He's also, a figure that makes sense from one angle in his historical context. I mean, you can find in the book of Acts Paul warning against other false prophets, right? Like in some very superficial sense, Jesus is of a type. And one of the things I'm arguing in the book is that we can see in the patterns that emerge in the kind of charismatic leaders who are particularly effective in a given era of American history. We can find clues to the abiding anxieties and fears and desires of that time. So Jesus is one of a number of self-described messiahs and prophets who are speaking to the anxieties and fears of a colonized people, right? Jews living under Roman occupation. So all of that absolutely means that, whether you were living in the first century or whether you are living today, you shouldn't simply accept Jesus's claims at face value. For me, what was so powerful about studying the historical evidence in a deeper way was first to learn that the Gospels are credible as sources that get us pretty close to the circumstances immediately around this miraculous claim. And secondly, to learn from scholars like N.T. Wright that I had been a real chronological snob. I had been very guilty, I think, of just in a sort of half-baked and not particularly conscious way, dismissing the early Christians' behavior and belief in the resurrection because, people 2,000 years ago, they would believe anything, right? And I'm so ashamed to confess that to you because As a historian, I've always thought of myself as someone who had deep respect for my subjects. But the more I interrogated that, the more I realized it wasn't actually true. And when I learned more deeply about the cultural and religious context of Hellenistic Judaism, I became convinced by N.T. Wright's argument that while there's a spectrum of sort of theological options for people trying to understand what might happen to someone they believe might be the Messiah, and he dies, and what might happen, and what resurrection can mean and doesn't mean, this notion that there is a general resurrection at the end of history that is common for most Jews at this time. One thing that they absolutely did not expect, that completely breaks the mold of their cultural framework, is what the gospel writers and Paul in the letters claims happened. The bodily, sort of trans-physical, right, like weirdly physical, but still able to walk through walls and things, resurrection of this individual, not as part of the general resurrection. So my point is that we are invited to an evaluation of a fair amount of interesting evidence that, of course, cannot demonstrate a miracle because the historical method falls apart at the singularity of the miracle. If the historical method is premised on the idea that we can draw analogies between our lived experience of cause and effect in our lives and cause and effect in the past, and we define a miracle as divine interference in cause and effect, then of course you can't prove the miracle. But you can get close enough to the point where the leap of faith involved in accepting this claim is certainly no longer a leap, and for me became shorter than the leap back to the old worldview. So my point is that the same dilemmas that I think face a person today when dealing with a guru apply in the case of Jesus, and that same intellectual process is a reasonable one.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. In watching Ken Burns' The American Revolution, I was reminded of Washington's leadership, in which I think historians generally accept that but for his presence leading a ragtag army against the greatest military power on earth to a victorious conclusion, he is deemed one of the greatest military leaders ever to exist. Would you characterize, how do you differentiate? Was he charismatic? Was he a leader? What's the difference?
Yeah, I love that you brought up Washington. He's such an interesting case study. I write about him at the end of an era I call the era of the prophets, who are generally figures who are not at all like Washington. So I write about, from colonial Massachusetts, the great heretic Anne Hutchinson, to the prophetess Jemima Wilkinson, Ann Lee, the kind of one of the founding mothers of the Shakers. So these very heterodox, anti-institutional figures who speak to this terrifying sense of dislocation and chaos that many Americans are experiencing in the Revolutionary period. And that's not Washington, but Washington senses the dynamics in the cultural moment that those more prophetic figures diagnose in a way. And one pattern I found throughout my survey of American history is that those leaders who I would label as most successful, if by successful we mean able to instantiate their policy goals into institutions in a way that carries on beyond their own career. Washington is one of them, and the mark of them is that they do not hew tightly to the dominant charismatic type of their age, but rather they demonstrate an agility, an ability to lean into it sometimes, but then pull back, or simply respond to the problem, the desire, the anxiety that it is expressing and answer that set of needs in a different way. And I would put Washington in this category. I mean, as a military leader, I think his record was and remains fairly controversial and mediocre, right? And he came under a great deal of criticism, certainly among his peers. And I think a lot of what we remember, the sort of image of like the dark Valley Forge winter and the way he carried up the morale of his troops. There are these sort of tableaus that have bled their color into the overall image of Washington, maybe in a way that is a bit at odds with the facts of his career as a general, at least early in the war. But what is so important is the way he responds to the needs of Americans for a sense of stability and continuity balanced with newness. One of his grand entrance, passing through Trenton after the war is over. I mean, the newspaper accounts of this are so vivid. The just resplendent kind of Roman imperial decorations and children dressed up in kind of Roman cherubic garb, tossing flowers, and his message, as understood by the journalists, as expressly a promise to the women of the Republic that he will make the world safe again for them. So there's a way in which the kind of what people sometimes call a sort of cult of Washington. I know all the the plateware and the songs in his honor and so forth may express this sincere affection that is a response to Washington's psychological astuteness, combined with, I think, his practical sense of where any leader had to hit the brakes on his own ego for the good of the institution. Charismatic leaders are always in this kind of dialectic with institutions. I think you can see this in Max Weber, who on the one hand writes about charismatic leaders with a sense of nervous foreboding, but then there are other points in his writing where you almost get the sense that he's rooting for them because they are the sort of disruptive X factor in the long bureaucratizing march of modernity that he's actually very worried about, right? Weber calls modernity an iron cage, famously. And institutions do sometimes become sclerotic, they need a disruptor, but too often, it's much easier to tear down than to rebuild. And so I think the other key piece of Washington's genius was understanding that his charisma, for it to have any lasting effect, it depended on ceding power to the institution and the structures.
Wow. Thank you for your perspectives. I've about a million questions, but I'll ask two, and you can decide on how to answer either one of them. Higher education, liberal arts education, is under fire, and if the original foundation is to open one's mind to multiple and opposing viewpoints, and is higher ed really part of the polarization of this country in becoming less agnostic, or and then my other question is, when you became a Christian, did your tribe fracture?
I do think people in higher education bear some of the blame for the polarization of the country. There are sociologists who've done good work on the kind of long-range partisanship in higher education. And so it's been the case for probably at least a century that at least elite higher education in this country, the faculty in it have tilted left of the mainstream of the American populace. That's an old pattern. My university, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, was nicknamed Red Hill in the 1910s or something, right? So this is because it was a den of communists even back then. So this is not a new story. However, the degree to which the political persuasions of faculty deviates from the kind of average spread of the American people has become much more extreme. in the past generation, especially in the humanities and some of the softer social sciences. And I've pondered this a lot. I know Daniel has pondered this a lot too. Why is this? I think it's a complicated set of factors, but it is connected to the changes in higher ed and the broader culture in the 1960s. And the reasonable self-reflection on the part of humanists that their job in the culture was changing. So I think up to that point, there was more confidence that what we are doing in the humanities is, at least in part, giving students the tools to think about the true and the good and the beautiful, and to have a sense of the civilization that they are in, that is a gift to them. But as the liberation movements begin challenging the composition of the canon, raising incredibly legitimate questions about who has or has not been included and what's defined as the best that this culture has produced, there resulted, I think, a total crisis of confidence among humanists about what their job in the formation of students really is. And at the same time, at a more practical level, there is a widening of options of study for students, and the proliferation of lanes of study we could call the vocational majors, right? So communication, engineering, psychology and all its children, exercise and sports science, things like this. And those are the majors that have really siphoned off enrollment from English, philosophy, history, more so than the hardcore STEM majors. So there's a real sense of institutional existential crisis, a sense of needing to demonstrate one's value to society and to the dean who's counting heads, right? And I think in this context, a new vision of what the humanities are about, informed by a sort of second-hand absorption of a particular roster of theorists, people like Michel Foucault, who in himself, if you actually read him, is a really interesting and challenging thinker, but who I think has been sort of received by the professoriate in the humanistic disciplines as a overly simplified master key to all human problems, in which the matrix through which you should view your area of study is the matrix of power, and that everything that is interesting and worth studying can be made decipherable by figuring out who has power and who doesn't. And it's the job of scholars and the students they're training to figure this out and rectify it. It's a very reductionistic picture of human problems, but it's very seductive because it gives you a sort of quick raison d'etre, a way of framing what you're about. And at the same time, there emerged pressure for certain kind of being at the institutional level, a need to be seen to be doing something about structural racism and so forth on the part of administrators. And it becomes very easy for humanists to say, well, we can make ourselves valuable by filling certain, again, very reductionistic kind of quotas for our administrators who can be seen to be doing something about these broad social problems if they are offering courses in the studies, right? And dividing humans into these very simplistic identity categories. And there's a way in which that ecosystem then trains more of its own. And I mean, I've personally had the experience of, because what we know when we do polls of incoming graduate students is that for the most part their politics are pretty set when they start graduate school. So it's not, as far as we know, it's generally not that students are sort of pushed far to the left politically in their training. It's that our process is selecting for students who are already politicized in that mode. But I have had myself students who are more conservative or just moderate, not particularly politically politicized. And they feel very alienated by what I think has become maybe a broader cultural pattern, which is not unique to academia, which is the tendency to assume that everyone in the room, even though maybe you've never met them before or you hardly know them, agrees with you about a growing roster of issues. And to just speak as if you can assume that this is true and to close off room for any argument. And I've had students leave the program or finish but decide they don't want to go into higher ed. And so that compounds the problem. Now, I also think that there's a way in which higher ed tends to be blamed by politicians on both the left and the right or for social problems that begin far downstream, and we are only one piece of a broader puzzle. And a major reason why we've lost credibility with the American public is that it is so expensive in this country, right? So I think students would be more interested in kind of exploring open inquiry and life of the mind, and they wouldn't perhaps feel so much pressure to take classes that someone has told them are practical if they didn't have to go into debt so frequently to get our degrees. So that's part of it. Although in Europe, where education is much cheaper, they have some similar dynamics, so it's not purely a matter of this. And I regret I don't remember your second question.
Your tribe is cracked.
Oh, my tribe. What I have found in my kind of process of coming out to people as a Christian has been that it's been very humbling, and that I have, I would say, in making sense of people's reactions, it is maybe 3% about me and 97% about the individual and their own particular history with organized religion, their own kind of temperament. So I guess I thought the beginning of this process that all the people I know who are sort of broadly secular Democrats, non-church going, that they would all react in kind of the same way. And that has not been true in the least. I can remember a dinner I had at an academic conference shortly after I became a Christian with 3 of my friends from other universities, and had almost the character of an intervention a little bit. And so that one was a kind of a secular Jew, one is an atheist who grew up fairly fundamentalist and went to seminary and is sort of a recovering evangelical, and then the third is an atheist Marxist. And the secular Jew was just really sort of pained for me and saying, Molly, don't you realize that no one's ever going to take your scholarship seriously again, and you have to be practical about this. But he wasn't sort of personally activated. The recovering evangelical was much more inclined to see me as now complicit in a political movement. And he had no time, when I would say, well, my whole research has always been about the diversity within evangelicalism, and the church I go to is really complicated, and the pastoral team is actually in their own views quite critical of Republicans and Trump. And if this is a problem right now, isn't the thing to do to be part of this community and complicate people's picture of what an evangelical is? And I proudly claim that label, evangelical. But he could not get past, the 81%. You are now part of the 81%. You are allowing yourself to become a trophy for the movement, really characterizing it as a movement. And this whole time, the atheist Marxist was sitting totally quiet. And then the dinner broke up. It was all very loving. I do want to emphasize that. They were berating me, but from a place of love. They were really worried about me. But we were walking away from the restaurant, and the Marxist said, Molly, I'm really sorry about that. I just want to say, you and me, we're totally cool. You're the same person you always were. And I was scratching my head a bit about that initially, but then I realized that as a Marxist, as someone who is convinced by, Marxism is essentially a Christian heresy, is convinced by this eschatological, very kind of intellectual worldview. He, of the 3 of them, really gets my very sort of intellectual process and the way that you could come to a conclusion about evidence and change your working hypothesis of the universe. In some ways I was more legible to him. I do think there are 2 kinds of people, And these people can be found both among observant religious types as well as totally secular non-believers. But in both those worlds, there are people for whom you cannot be a human and not want to know where the universe came from. Like, how can you not care about that? How can you not want to know, if miracles are real? And then there are people, some of whom are lovely, devoted members of their religious communities, for whom those questions are totally beside the point. And all that matters is, do you love your neighbor? And do you do the kind of practical business of making your community work? And these metaphysics, they're just distractions. And I have found that a lot of people in my life who are in that latter category, because my process was so focused on the resurrection, I am totally illegible to them. And I think all I can do is just kind of prove by being normal for enough time that I did not join a cult, and then I win maybe a little more airtime.
Well, proving to be normal over a period of time is pretty much the Presbyterian way. So, Molly, thank you so much. What an outstanding presentation.